So my name's Hanying Zhang. I'm an outreach assistant from Mocha, and I'm here with Dong Mengyu, who's a photographer and a freelance journalist. And we're going to talk about her photo essay and also about her personal experience living in 2020. Okay, so to start with, I think first I kind of want to talk about your project, and then we can loop back to your sort of personal reflection and personal experience of the Black Lives Matter movement that you're documenting, and also like the rise in anti-Asian hostility since the outbreak of COVID in the US. Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So I just want to learn a little bit about your inspiration. What was the catalyst for you to start this project of documenting the Black Lives Matter movement with a focus on Asian American activism? And if you could remember, was there a specific moment or a specific tipping point for you?
I think there are actually two reasons for me to start this project. First of all is that I've been working in DC metro area for the past 4 years, but I've never actually physically lived in the city. So it was right before the passing of George Floyd that I was planning on moving to the city actually. And I remember that it was, I think, late May. While I was moving, it just sort of struck me as how, even though that the two places that I was moving in between, it was only about like 15 minutes drive, but the whole atmosphere was so different. So before I lived in suburbs, and it was really quiet and peaceful, and it seems like nothing will ever change and nothing has ever changed. But on that night, I was moving to DC. There was like a huge protest going on outside of the White House. And there were, choppers in the air, and there were troops on the ground, and there were protesters. And that was actually the first night, I think, the police officers actually used tear gas on protesters. So I was just, because I was moving, I was just driving past that part of town, and then I just saw that with my own eyes, and it just struck me as how different the whole environment was from what I saw that morning from my suburb, the environment that I used to live in. So it just sort of struck me as I guess it sort of inspired me because I think that now that I'm living in this environment, I somehow feel obligated to tell what I see and sort of like document as the protest is ongoing, document from my own perspective how this protest was carried out, and what I see on the ground with my own eyes. And this is the first aspect of why I started this photo essay. And the second aspect is actually sort of responding to a lot of the misinformation that I saw on especially the Chinese internet. So I was having conversation with my family and friends back in China, and a lot of them were understandably very concerned about both, because of the pandemic and also because of the ongoing protests. They were concerned about my safety and everything. And as much as I appreciated their concern, what sort of threw me off was the fact that a lot of their concern were coming from not like fact-based, news, but a lot of like the misinformation and also like the disinformation that unfortunately exists on WeChat and platforms like Weibo. So there was one morning that I woke up and I saw like a myriad of text messages from my family and friends back in China, and they were asking me, wow, you know what, I saw on Weibo that the electricity and like internet had been cut off in Washington DC. I just wanted to check on how you are doing. And then I was really like, I didn't know where that was coming from until later I found out that apparently that was this rumor that started on Twitter and was quickly transferred to Weibo. And then it gained so much attention that so many people in China saw that piece of news, and then they thought it was true. And they sort of equated this ongoing protest with like lawlessness and chaos. And so many of those labels that you attach to something that it's far away from you, and then something that you saw based on like fragmented information online. So I thought, now that I'm physically in the city, so I should be, try to tell the story from my own perspective, and as a conversation that I would have with also like both my family and friends, and also like a larger Chinese speaking community in both China and the United States. So that's sort of like how at first I thought, I think it inspired me to start this project.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think I read, so it was part of, I forget which platform, but you did talk about how you were trying to refute some of the WeChat groups rants, and like with like mini essays and things that you wanted to use. I think you said you wanted to use logic, but it's kind of hard to convey that with logic and not emotion. And then you found photos to be a really good outlet to kind of convey disinformation to your family members and friends on a WeChat or like these Chinese social media platforms. So I thought that was a really good message, and I totally agree with you that physically seeing these photos was very inspiring. And I read through your photo essays, and I thought the story was really impactful and really interesting. I guess this lends me into the question of, besides just starting this dialogue with your immediate family, which you did, what sort of broader message are you trying to convey with your photo essays? And yeah, like how to, I guess you pointed to the larger Chinese speaking community, but could you speak about on that a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, I think like the way that I view my role in this photo essay is that I am simply a messenger. So the fact that I can put together this photo essay is because there are so many, Chinese and also like Asian activists on the ground doing all these amazing work. And what I'm doing is that I was simply documenting what they were doing. And I just, I mean, for me, I think this photo, I wanted this photo essay to serve as a window for other people to see that there are these voices, pro racial justice and supportive of Black Lives Matter movement that exist in Chinese community and the Asian community at large. So I think, at the same time, I want, the Chinese community, obviously, who happen to read my photo essay, to know that there are these voices that Chinese activists, especially the younger generation, are trying to tell the world that, hey, what, we care about these issues. And also at the same time, I want, I guess, the fact that this conversation is very much like a cross-racial one. I think a part of me also want like a non-Asian community to see these photos and see, the faces of these activists, and say, oh, I'm really glad that this conversation is not only about Black people, it's not only about Black people and white people. There are other communities who are participating in this conversation, and then having their voices heard.
Thank you for that. I agree with you. It's really important to see, it's in a way representation as well. I think to see Asian American activism, and that also sort of dispels a lot of perceptions, I guess, that people have of the Asian American community at large. So thank you for doing that. And I guess this other question is, you talked about being a messenger for Chinese and Asian activists. I'm wondering if you recall any particularly interesting conversations or perspectives that you've heard from these activists, and also how exactly you've been able to approach them, and were they receptive to what you were doing? And yeah, so.
I think the first, actually, the first time that I heard there was this ongoing campaign that's called Chinese for Black Lives. I heard that from WeChat. It's because I interviewed some feminist activists like a few years back for another project that they were doing. And some of them happened to be the core organizers of this campaign. And the campaign itself started in New York. And I know that they were planning on talking to local Chinese business owners and, sort of like encourage them to display support for Black Lives Matter. And at the time, I didn't know how big the event is going to be. And I certainly I didn't know that it was going to, spread to other cities like, Boston and also Washington, D.C., the city I'm living in. So the first Chinese activist that I saw face to face in Washington, D.C. was Jackie, the first gentleman I featured in my photo essay. And it was an afternoon outside of White House, and people were staging protests. And I was just going through the crowd, and his message and his poster just like instantly captured my eyes. So I started taking pictures of him. And he was very helpful. And, some people get, put off when there's like a photographer just like taking picture of you, like, for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, just like, some people get really nervous, but he was really receptive. And so after I took some pictures, I just approached him and asked him, I told him that, I was a photographer and I really liked your sign. And I was wondering if you want, a copy of your photos sent to you. And so maybe we can add each other on Instagram or something. So that's how I approached them. And that ended up being my way of approaching a lot of these activists, on the ground. So what I would do is that I would take their pictures and then I will approach them and ask them if they want a copy. And when I send them their pictures, I would ask them, can you tell me a little bit more why you're here and why, you think this is something important that you feel like, you should be part of this. So many of them, wrote back to me and with this like long messages explaining why they think this is important and how, they think that, as Chinese or Asian American, they should be taking part of this. And it gave me like all kinds of reasons and their personal stories. So I was really grateful. And I was, also very inspired by some of their viewpoints. I think one of the issues that I think resonated with me the most is the fact that many of them, I think I can give you like a concrete example is Zoe, the young lady I featured in the story. So she, her parents were from Hong Kong, and she was born and raised in the United States. And she said that although she has not personally experienced any police violence, and she also lived in suburbs in like a really peaceful, quiet neighborhood, and all individual police officers that she had interacted with was really nice to her. And she didn't have the experience of police violence just personally firsthand, but nevertheless she thinks that it's not about individual issue. So this is what she told me. The word she used was that when this is like a systemic issue, you can't simply use like your personal anecdote to say that, hey, I interacted with all these police officers and they're all nice people, so there is no police brutality and there's no institutional racism. So I think I would, then that point was also echoed by many of the other activists that I spoke to. So I think what really resonated with me is the fact that they were able to distinguish their personal experience with the larger environment that they're living in. So I think that takes a lot of compassion and self-reflection to be able to do that. So I think that that was one point that stood out in many of the conversations that I had with this activist.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's a perspective that is often more prevalent within younger Asian and Chinese Americans. Do you agree? Um, I'm wondering, sort of, have you've personally, have you noticed sort of a generational gap in understanding of this, like the Black Lives Matter issue? And sort of, this is more of a bigger question.
Right.
Sort of, why do you think there exists, if there is, this generational gap? And how do you think we can come to overcome it?
I think, well, the fact that, you know, the people that I featured in this photo essay all happen to be young people. And I think partially that it's because, first of all, like most protesters at the scene were young people, regardless of their race. And there were, I think, a few times that I saw families of, you know, Asian families at the protest scene. And so I think I'm not sure, like, to a larger extent how different it is between generations when it comes to topics of racial justice. That is certainly the stereotype that, you know, younger Asian American or Chinese Americans are more aware of these racial injustices versus the older generation who tend to be more conservative and more pro-police. But I don't think I've talked to enough older generation in the Chinese and Asian community to be able to say that definitively. Although I would say, though, I think a few years back, because I also have family, older generations living in the United States. And a few years back, when the Black Lives Matter movement first started, their attitude toward police violence was very different from what they have today. So for example, I was talking to my aunt and uncle who live in Missouri and who came here a few decades back. So I remember when, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests first broke out, they very much, you know, equated the demands of these protesters to, you know, lawlessness and chaos. They didn't see a point of, you know, so-called systematic violence or racism within the police force. Partially because, you know, their personal experience with the police force was very much different from what, you know, the stories that shared by some of these protesters. So I think at first it was harder for them to wrap their mind around the fact that, you know, regardless of your individual experience, there might exist like a larger picture that we as individuals fail to see because of, you know, our personal limitations. But I think the passing of George Floyd, that really served as a catalyst for them to educate themselves more
Oh,
about.
I'm sorry. Is your audio cutting out?
Oh,
Oh,
how about
there we
right
go.
now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I was saying that, so I think the passing of George Floyd, that really served as a catalyst for many of us to do self-reflection and self-education. And I remember I was having this conversation with my aunt after the video surfaced online. And she was saying that, you know what, I saw the video and you know, I couldn't, I wept. When I saw, you know, George Floyd was, you know, visibly, you know, the life of him was like visibly, you know, leaving his body. and the fact that the officer refused to let him go, and that really, you know, struck me as a human being. And I think that, you know, this is like obviously a terribly wrong, and this needs to be addressed. And I think that this was the first time I heard she say anything like this. And she was also sharing, you know, articles about police violence on her WeChat moments, which I think was very rare. And also I think it's very encouraging that she and some of, you know, her friends around her were starting to think about these issues, as you know, after the passing of George Floyd and the recent protest. I think that that's a very good opportunity for not only younger Chinese and Asian activists, but also some of the older generations to rethink, you know, their own limitations and perspectives, and to, you know, be more aware of these ongoing national conversation, and like to also contribute their voice to this conversation. So I guess I don't know just how much of a gap that still exists, but I think the gap is definitely narrowing from like my own perspective.
Thank you for sharing that story. I guess now is a good time to sort of segue, I think, into more of your personal reflections of the moment. So you mentioned how you moved to DC, and that was sort of your first time witnessing the protests, and also how, just like you mentioned the tear gas being used and how vivid that image was for you. I'm wondering what, let's like going back to like 2014, 2015 to Ferguson and until now, what have been your reflection and reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement? And I guess you already talked about how other people in your life have responded to the movement, but I'm just curious about how your perceptions have evolved over time.
I think back in 2014, I was a student at University of California, Berkeley. And because, you know, Berkeley is traditionally known as a really progressive and, you know, where, you know, a lot of students do care and advocate for social justice issues. So I think compared to, I think like an average Chinese students in America, I think I was, just by virtue of being in that environment, I was really lucky to, you know, be more aware, and also, you know, be able to have these conversations with a lot of students, and you know, to be, I think I treated that as an opportunity of being educated about some of the racial matters in America. And I remember that there was also protests in Berkeley when the Ferguson protest broke out. And but I think what, at the time it was still very much at the beginning of you know, the learning process for me, because I personally, I grew up in China, and I came to the States at the age of 18 for college education. And I think, you know, the sort of the history lesson that I received about United States while I was in China was very, I don't know how to categorize that, maybe like superficial. So I guess what I thought was that, racism is, you know, like a historical thing. And, you know, there used to be slavery in the United States, and that got taken care of after the Civil War. And then, you know, I know that there were like Jim Crow and segregation like after the Civil War, but I think the very limited readings that I did about American history, I just had the impression that this is no longer an issue, or at least it's no longer as acute as it used to be. And I thought, at least on paper, or in like from like a legal or a systemic standpoint, there is no racism. That's what I thought. I thought, maybe individual people still harbored different kinds of bias personally, but like on an institutional level, there is no longer discrimination. That's the sort of mentality that I had before coming to the States. So I think my education and also my personal experience after coming here is constantly evolving. And Black Lives Matter movement back in 2014 was also one of the checkpoint for me to be able to understand like more deeply about the structural issues that still exist in terms of racial justice in American society. At the time, I didn't know that the protest was going to be how large the scale is going to be, and how much of an impact it's going to have on American society. Because I think at the time when something is like happening real time, it's kind of hard for you to grasp just how much gravity it's going to have eventually. But I do remember watching, protests from, my dorm window, and thinking that, maybe this is a good opportunity to involve more people in this ongoing conversation about racism. But I guess it didn't really sink in until I was able to put some like time and distance between myself and the movement, to be able to really, sit down and have like a deeper reflection of how that movement was going to shape people's conversation about racism. So I think after I moved to Washington, D.C. And started working as a journalist, that was when I really sort of took a deeper dive into American society and some of the, the issues surrounding it.
That is such an interesting perspective, because you talked about you moved here when you were 18. That is like, so it's for me that hearing about your impression about racism, I about in the US, I assume that's probably a lot of like recent immigrants' impression of the US. And like this is just a comment that I've thought of, is like, I bet there is that disconnect of like, what are they talking about, systemic racism? Like, and it's also already an abstract idea to think about systemic racism, that I find that really, really interesting. And what you said about personal reflection and putting distance between you and yourself and the events, that does really resonate with me, because I think I was quite young when Ferguson started happening. And for me, in my mind, I also had a very shallow understanding of the event, and also of American history in general. But now, like, I think it's more impactful now, even because people have taken the time to kind of digest the information. So thank you for sharing that. And I think you've talked about your background already, and I'm curious as to why you pursued journalism, and was it like these things that you were seeing at Berkeley, the conversations you were having, that sort of propelled you towards this field?
Why I studied journalism. So I think that definitely has something to do with how, like, my background. So I kind of had like a sort of like a different upbringing with like many other Chinese person of my age and my generation. So I was born in Chongqing, and I moved to Inner Mongolia when I was like 1 year old, and I was raised by my grandparents primarily. So I spent like 5-6 years in Inner Mongolia as a kid before my grandparents and I moved to Beijing, where I started school. But I think deep in my mind, I always sort of had like a deeper connection with Inner Mongolia than I had with Beijing. So I remember growing up, I also like I sort of often felt like I was this like bystander in Beijing, and I didn't really think that I was part of the city so much so as an observer of the city. So I guess that sort of first, I guess the thing that sort of inspired me to be a journalist, or the thing that I found the most interesting of being a journalist, is the opportunity to talk to different people, and then observe their lives, and see each and every individual's perspectives. So that was one thing that I think I really liked about being a journalist, is this opportunity to connect with different people from like different generations, different countries, and different walks of life. So and so after I came to the United States to study, I had the opportunity to do an like exchange semester between Berkeley and Washington D.C. So we had like a program that will allow you to come to DC for one semester and do research and study, and do like internships. So that was I had the opportunity to study at Washington Post with an editor there, and that was sort of like I think my first real window into how journalism works in the United States. So after that, I thought I should. This sounds like an interesting idea. So I decided that I should give it a try after graduation. So that's why I sort of like I guess my first experience of like dipping my toe into this field was this opportunity that I had during my undergraduate year. So and I think the fact that I'm curious about different people's perspective, and the fact that I want to connect with them and hear what they have to say, I think that has something to do with my upbringing.
Sorry for the pauses. I'm just taking notes. So
Yeah, no
if you
worries.
see my eyes wander to the side, it's just I have a doc open. Thank you for sharing that. And that is a very also a very interesting background of yours. Growing up in Mongolia and then moving to Beijing. Um, Even though you were young when you were in Inner Mongolia, but I think how like you felt as an observer and how that kind of connected later on to your experience in the US studying at the Post. Um, that's a great story, and I think that's really interesting. Um, I think this other question is more of, this is a general question about how you've been coping with the events of 2020, including the rise in anti-Asian hostility since the outbreak of the virus. And if you could briefly connect that to maybe your work um, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and how, if you see a connection between them at all.
Well, personally, I think it's just lucky on my part. I haven't personally experienced any like anti-Asian violence or like abuse during this pandemic. But I think from my conversation with some of the Chinese activists in this Chinese for Black Lives Matter movement, what they share with me is that because of some of these, the fact that the president called it a Chinese virus, and the fact that there are so many like microaggression or not so microaggression on like a day-to-day level, I think that really made it easier for these activists to connect with a broader Chinese and Asian communities, especially the younger people, and also people who had like a similar background as me, who like grew up in China and then came here to study. So what some of these activists shared with me is that, so before they often found that it's difficult to talk to these Chinese students, the importance of participating in some of these like political events and campaigns, because they think that they're just going to be here for a few years to study, and they're very much an outsider, and that they don't have a standing in having these conversations that are more or less related to American domestic politics. Right, so they are really hesitant when you say you should step out and then have your voices heard, and it's often really difficult for you to convince them that they should do this, and then they do have a standing in doing this. But then after COVID, after some of these discriminations that are either made public, by public officials, or made obvious, by these conversations online, or maybe in some instances they have experienced it themselves. It's much more, it's much easier, and also much more urgent for these people to participate in this conversation. And I think in a way it's become more of a I guess it's just it made it easier to like involve in a broader community in these kind of events, and they are more receptive. They become more receptive to the idea of coming out and then having their voices heard. And also at the same time, because of some of these unpleasant experience that they had during this pandemic, it made them more receptive or more empathetic to the sufferings and some of the difficulties and discriminations that these other minority groups suffer in the United States. It just made other people's suffering more relatable once you experience something yourself, or that even if you don't experience it personally, like you sort of like as part of this community, you sort of experience this targeted hate against your community, against who you are. And I think it made it easier to have these conversations with these Chinese and Asian American people, especially like younger generations, and those who come to the States at a later age. It sort of made the conversation easier with them, and made them more aware of these like structural issues that exist in the United States. Then I also wanted to follow up on an earlier point that I made about how shallow the understanding that I had about American society before coming here. So because Chinese society also had like its share of like discrimination, and especially like structural issues. For example, we had this like household registration system where it's literally like by paper you are not born into like equal terms. So I think when these conversations about equality and social justice, when we have these kind of conversation in China, oftentimes people like to bring up United States as an example of how things can be. So very much like in a like overseas settings, US was seen as especially for like some group of liberal intellectuals in China, they like to use US as an example of how a society can be just. Just look at the example United States. They don't have household registration system. People can move freely in the country, and then you don't, like, you can move from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, and you are considered part of Pennsylvania, and there's no strings attached. Unlike in China, like if you are born in like Hubei province, and you can't just move to Beijing just because you feel like it. And so I think part of me, and then also that's like a very much like a collective experience of many of the younger Chinese students who decided to study in America, And oftentimes, their decision was also prompted by these conversations, and that's what made me and some of my friends curious about American society. The fact that it's portrayed as this like land of the free, right? Or like you can have your dream, and if you are willing to work hard, then you can achieve it, and there's no institutional barrier against that. And this is very much a belief that many of the, not only like the younger generation, but also like older generations, it's also, this sort of belief and conviction is what I guess at least partially encouraged them to leave everything behind and then come to a brand new country to sort of try out your luck and then see if you can succeed in this society that's being portrayed as this equal opportunity for everyone, and as a place that you can try out your talent, try out your luck, and then see if you can succeed. So I think it can be difficult for especially like new immigrants who came here and then realize that what, and some of the information we had might not be totally accurate. And this society, as great as it is, it still has a lot of issues, and these issues they are having real impact on communities living in here. It's not just a historical issue, and these impacts disproportionately fell on people of color and the minority community, and this very much involves people from Asia. Like Asian community is also very much impacted by these like structural issues in American society. I think that needs a bit of willingness to say that some of the assumptions that we had was wrong or not accurate, or that needs to be adjusted as we experience more and then understand more about the society. And also it also takes a bit of courage to say that despite these structural issues, I think we still have a role in making the society a better place. So I think for me, this was something that contributed to my awareness of racial issues in the United States.
Thank you for sharing that point. And I think I was about to ask sort of what do you see as the common reaction to just kind of breaking this perception of America, that it really is not as equal as we like it to be, or for the world like us to be. But it seems like you've seen a lot of optimism and a lot of positive reaction, which is, well, let's not be quiet now. Like, we have a stake in this conversation now, like what you said about a lot of the activists you spoke to who are students from China. So like, not, they didn't grow up here, and that it's been able to bridge kind of the Chinese community in the US, that now we have something in common. It's not, that's not just kind of like our ethnicity. So I think that's really interesting, and I'm glad you've seen a lot of optimism and sort of a positive reaction to perhaps not having your assumptions met by this country. And I think just now I'm wondering this is another broad question. What are the lessons that 2020 have personally taught you, and sort of how do you think this will kind of inform your future actions?
You mean in terms of racial justice or
everything? Yeah, just I think a lot of people, so just to give you an example, a lot of people have realized just how globalized, for me, just how globalized the world has become, that one cough across the world can come over, or like just have the entire world will experience it. And just like the need for global cooperation and also for group solidarity with the racial justice movement, and how important that is. So I think many people have been having these sort of reflections about the like broader concepts that, like you said, reach beyond their personal limitations. So I'm just wondering, kind of, what lessons do you think this year, it's not over yet, but so far, how, like, what has it taught you, and how would it inform your actions in the future?
Okay. Well, I think one thing that I guess surprised me is the fact that despite these, like, antagonism that exists between US and China now, people still have the appetite for human stories. I think that sort of surprised me because I started sharing about my observations for the Black Lives Matter movement on WeChat. I started a public account, like a personal blog account, where I post some of my pictures, and also the conversations I have with protesters, not just Chinese or Asian protesters, but just like random observations that I have when I was like physically at the protest scene. So for about a month, I pretty much went to White House and the Capitol Hill, and wherever there's protests, I was there. So I had a lot of these like random interactions with people, and I shared them on WeChat. And at first, I think I sort of expected there would be people who say that just because the public opinion, both in the US and in China, are sort of, I think I saw like this survey by Pew Research Center a few days ago that says the like unfavorable perception among Americans towards China is at its historical high. I think there was about like over 70% of survey respondents who said that they have this unfavorable perception about PRC. And I don't know if there is an equivalent survey in China, but I would guess that the number would be pretty close to each other. And also, I've also had people when I sometimes I visit family back in China, I would have my family and friends ask me, why are you still in America? Why don't you come back? And sometimes they say this with the assumption that there will be a war sometime in the future between these two countries. And they were saying that if there is a war, who are you gonna help? Like, which side are you on? And that question like taunts me every time someone asks me that. And because I grew up in China, but I also spent like 9-10 years in America now. So I think both countries, I have stakes in both countries. And then I know people, like human faces in both countries. And it's really hard for me to, when you throw like an umbrella question to me, it's really hard for me to just give you like an oversimplified answer that I'm with America or I'm with China. So I think when I first started sharing about these protests, I had the assumption that people would either ignore me, or like they would find it uninteresting, or they might think that they might not have the stomach to read something that's so trivial and so there's no like clear cut moral standpoints in my stories. It's not like I'm like taking a standing to say that these protests are wrong, are naive. So there's no like clear points. Oftentimes it's just my random observations. But I was really surprised when a lot of people, and many of whom they used to share super nationalistic things on their WeChat, and I would assume that they would be put off by my stories, but they actually came to me and said, you know, I think what you're sharing is really valuable, because, you know, we see all these news stories on Chinese television about how these protests are going, you know, in America, how violent they are. But I think your story gives, you know, a different perspective, and then it's sort of, you know, filled in the gap between, you know, what we can see on TV, and also the increasingly, you know, polarized social media atmosphere. So I think, and some of them actually asked me if I would give them permission to repost some of my stories in their WeChat or share with their family members, which I was really happy and really surprised when they come to me with requests like this. So which means that I think if there's any like hopeful tales that I you know, experienced in this crazy 2020 pandemic, is the fact that despite these antagonism between like two huge countries, and between, you know, these like abstract ideas and political, you know, struggles, or, you know, like people, like countries and politicians struggling for power, and despite all these huge concepts and realities, I think people on a day-to-day level still wanted to connect with each other on a human level. So I think once once you give people like a personal story, they're still in the mood of reading it and understanding, you know, what the other side's perspective is. And just regardless of how different their circumstances are from yours, I think there are things that are mutual, or like a common experience or a common theme between, you know, just different groups of people. So I think that sort of gives me hope. And also, I think you mentioned this earlier in our conversation, that so I said at first I wanted to refute, you know, all those misinformation with like mini essays. So I would say that, you know, this is wrong, and all these like like history lessons, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I realized, you know, people either don't engage with you because they don't have the all these like background knowledge that I do, because, you know, I acquired this like after what, like 9 years in America, right? You can't expect people to be able to understand what you're talking about just by reading your messages on WeChat. And I think people like especially some of my family and friends, they were put off by my mini rants. So and later on, I realized that, you know, you share a picture of, you know, young Chinese protesters holding up a sign that says "Black lives are our lives." That actually speaks 1,000 words in itself. And I think it's about like putting a human face on an abstract idea that would make it much more relatable to people who you know, might not know all the specifics, but they know, like they see someone's like an activist face or an activist posters, they see their message, and it's just easier to connect on a personal level, and it's possible. So I think my own experience taught me it's possible. It's possible to change people's perspectives through these trivia. So I think, yeah, that's one thing that I found was really encouraging, I guess, during these like crazy, sometimes like polarizing environment, and this like, not just like domestically, but like globally. I think the conversation across different aisles is also, it's still possible. It just takes a bit more energy, maybe.
I don't believe anything you're doing is trivia. I think it's very impactful, and I totally agree with you that like photos do speak 1,000 words sometimes. And like it's much more effective. And I think looking through your photos and reading the captions and the stories, it was both interesting and also again impactful, and it really shows the collective energy of the community, I think. And that's something that I really appreciate as well of this year. That at the same time that it seems like it's dividing people, it's also bringing people together, and having people reflect on all these things, all these abstract ideas. And I'm really glad that you are putting human faces onto these abstract concepts. And I know, do you have something to do right afterwards? Is it really tight? I know like we are reaching an hour long point. I was just
Oh,
wondering if we can go a little bit over.
yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. I just wanted to make sure that you have another appointment right afterwards. But yeah, so that was my wrap up question. The broad, what lessons have you taken from the year 2020? Thank you so much for talking with us and for an hour and sharing your stories. I really appreciated insight. I really appreciate it and enjoyed our conversation. I think I've also learned a lot as a Chinese American, like hearing from your perspective. It's slightly different from mine, but I think equally important. Yeah, but so I think the last point I will make, another logistical point, is if you'll be, so we're looking to make this collection with both this oral history interview, kind of my write-up of notes, and also currently digital artifacts, because we can't physically have artifacts yet. But we were wondering if it'll be okay to share some of the photos that you took within the collection, and also if you have like screenshots of WeChat messages that you believe relate to your story, videos and photos and audios of your daily life and how you experience it, maybe at the protest, maybe of you interviewing activists. Please feel free, please, we really appreciate it if you share it with us to include within the collection. And that I can follow up with an email with more information on that, but you can just share with me through email.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And I think you mentioned something about having the activist contact. I think it would be also, we would love to speak to more of these activists. If they're comfortable sharing their contact information with us, and if it's all right with them.
Yeah, I did reach out to them. So, of course, they're really happy to speak with you. I think one of them said that during one of their canvassing, they actually put like a flyer in your museum.
Oh yeah, really?
Yeah, hoping to because they assume that there will be a lot of member of our community visiting your museum. So they wanted to see if they can potentially reach more people. So my question is, are you, because I think they're although they have like core organizers, this is a very like a decentralized campaign.
Sure.
So I'm not sure like if you're interested in speaking with people based in New York, or do you have like a specific focus of who you are looking for?
So this is the organization Chinese for Black Lives, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think ideally we are just wondering, that is a very good question.
Or feel free to get back to me once you think
Yeah.
about it, and then let me know.
Yeah, I might talk to.
Hello?
Like ideally want to
Hey,
share
honey.
a story that you
Sorry,
also agree that is sort of, oh,
no, you were cutting
yeah.
off
I was
a
frozen.
little
My
earlier.
internet, okay. I think, yeah, my internet is unstable. That is what it reads. Is this better
I
now?
was asking, yeah. I was saying
Okay.
that if you have like a focus of who you are willing to talk to.
Yeah, I think it would be really nice to talk to one of these starting members or an organizer, just about why and how they started having it rolling. But like you said, it is a decentralized group. of activists. So I can also get back to you in another follow-up email. My hope is that we will stay in touch like for the future for your collection, because we want to make sure we capture your story as accurately as possible. So I'll definitely follow up, and I'll follow up with an email about the digital artifacts as well.
Okay, great.
Okay, all right. Okay, so thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.